First of all, I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the organizers for including me. It's a really important conversation and something that I hope will become more and more prominent in the mathematical world. Like many of you here, I have spent a lot of time thinking about compassion in my own practice, mostly as a mathematics educator. And so my talk is kind of about my own reflections about the role compassion plays in my work as an educator. I teach in two very different environments currently. I've taught on pretty traditional college campuses in the past, and I'm currently teaching in two places. One is I teach incarcerated students in a maximum security prison, people who have matriculated in a bachelor's degree program. And the other is a small liberal arts college that has really targeted itself to make a home for people who might be marginalized elsewhere. So it has a huge population relative to the typical college campus of people who are non-binary in their gender expression and of people who are neurodiverse. So this creates a really interesting set of challenges as a teacher, and going back and forth between those two environments has really cast my thoughts about compassion and what compassion means in a whole new light, because there are such different needs in these different populations. So here are how I started reflecting on compassion. And I looked at the titles and abstracts for the other talks in this session, and they seemed to invoke compassion in a very different way than I think of the word. So that got me just really thinking about, what do I mean when I talk about compassion in math? So I started with, well, what is compassion? And I thought, okay, calm means together, and passion is the emotionality, the things we've talked about before. So compassion perhaps means sharing our passion with people. And that got me to reflect on, well, what are my mathematical passions? And this is just a few of them. It's exciting when I see patterns, or when I see the beauty in math, or figuring something out, the mathematical joy that's been spoken of. I'm actually passionate about mistakes, because that says there's something I don't understand, there's a gap to be filled. Witnessing the aha moment in a student when you see that light in their eyes at something that they never imagined would be attainable to them. Watching a student learn to believe in themselves. And I'll tell you an anecdote about this. In my incarcerated students, I teach a course called Algebra Workshop. It's sort of pre everything. It's just, a lot of these people have been out of school for a long time. For some of them, they completed a GED, but their last time in a classroom was in 8th grade 30 years ago. So it's really a workshop to try to get them just thinking mathematically. What does it mean to solve problems? What does it mean to collaborate? And early in the semester, I talk a lot about group work and what we learn from talking with one another, and the idea that you're the holder of truth, not me. And there was one student in the class who was slouched in his chair and rolling his eyes and saying out loud, like, this is never going to work. At the end of the semester, he asked me how he can join the MAA. So those kind of moments, that's a passion of mine, that if I get to witness that happening in one of my students, or in any student, it's just wonderful. There's a passion for learning something new, and even for learning something old, but in a new way. I, not too long ago, learned from an elementary teacher a new way to think about place value, and it really astonished me that I could understand place value more deeply at this moment of my life. And I'll share that at the end if I have time. So then I thought, okay, I need to know where the word comes from, just what's the etymology of the word compassion. And it comes from the Latin, and it actually means to suffer together. So it's not just about sharing passion, but the word passion actually comes from a root that's about suffering. So that, I spent some time thinking about that, and then wondering about what's the difference between compassion and empathy, which is a conversation that people have sometimes. And I came across this quote that I'll read to you because I found it very compelling. Compassion and empathy both refer to a caring response to someone else's distress, while empathy refers to an active sharing in the emotional experience of the other person. compassion adds to that emotional experience a desire to alleviate the person's distress. So this was all about my wanderings and sort of thinking about how I, as a math educator, really bring compassion into my work. So that led me to think about, well, suffering in math, if compassion is sharing suffering. So I'm sticking with this little box in the upper right-hand corner that compassion means suffering together. And I have a couple of observations. One, as we all know, many of our students are suffering, as are many of our colleagues. And then when we talk to some of our other colleagues about this, there's this overwhelming idea that math is value-free. So what could suffering possibly have to do with it? And this has been gone through many times before, both here and in other places, but some examples of suffering in math include feelings of inadequacy, anxiety about timelines, and that includes those timed multiplication tests in 4th grade, up through why do I have to have my homework in by Thursday when my parents just told me yesterday that they were getting a divorce, to I really can't get that last paper out before putting in my 10-year portfolio, right? So the micro to the macro. Frustration at not being seen, at your own thinking not being respected and valued. Or frustration as being seen as someone that you're not, as being someone, for example, who's struggling in math, as opposed to someone who's becoming a math learner, right? So the different labels and narratives that are applied to people. The fear of making mistakes and the humiliation that can often go with it. And I've met many students, and I imagine many of you have as well, who really talk about the trauma of their mathematics education. I've met a number of adult learners who can tell me the moment that the trauma overwhelmed them. I had one student tell me, it was in 3rd grade, and we were doing 2-digit multiplication, and she described the diagram in the margin of the workbook and what her teacher was wearing. You know, it was a very traumatic moment. It was the moment she realized, I don't have a mathematical mind. And not having your contributions valued. And again, that goes through young people, like what Ben was talking about, with our students really interacting democratically with one another, all the way on up through advanced professionals who do very important work that may not be valued in many cases because of their personal identities. So I apologize for the implied profanity here. I actually spent a lot of time while I was preparing this trying to come up with a synonym that was more appropriate and couldn't find one. I don't think other disciplines do this. Like, what are we doing as a community, as a discipline, that causes this kind of emotional distress in the people that we work with and that the people that we're taking responsibility for educating? So I'm going to take that a step further. Rather than compassion only meaning suffering together, that it means moving beyond suffering together. So here are some of my values as a math educator, and I share these on my syllabus with my students, and I talk about those. First of all, no one has a mathematical mind or a not mathematical mind. It's been refuted many, many times. But many people believe it very strongly, both those who believe they have the mathematical mind and others don't, and those who believe they don't, but others do. We're all inherently mathematical, and we each do it in our own way. It's just part of the human condition. Mathematics is a path to human flourishing, and I will let Francis say more about that when he gets up here. But the importance of math for just enriching us as human beings and how wonderful it can be, both in terms of its utility for participating in civic life and managing our own personal lives, but also just for the beauty of the ideas that it reveals. And finally, that like in any ecosystem, mathematics is enriched by a diversity of thought and ideas. And that diversity of thought and ideas can only happen when people feel free to participate, to make mistakes, to experiment, and to be themselves in the community. I said finally, but maybe this is the final one, that compassion doesn't mean sacrificing rigor. In fact, they're complementary. They help one another. If you're compassionate with students, it's easier for them to understand the need for rigor. And by being rigorous, you're actually having compassion for that student's intellectual development. There's often a narrative that if I'm compassionate or kind to my students, I have to water things down. And I don't even know where to begin to say that's just nonsense. It's easy to be kind, and it doesn't mean we have to sacrifice anything. So then I rethink my mathematical practice, and I would just want to give a nod here to a colleague, Jalan Ali, who has an organization called Compassionate Math and does professional development in this area with teachers and young people, really trying to help them overcome their own mathematical trauma and learning how to help their students overcome mathematical trauma. So one of the things that's become very important to me as an educator is that my job is not to teach. My job is to facilitate learning on behalf of my students. And often when I hear mathematics faculty talk about what they're going to teach next semester, they'll say things like, I have to cover chapter 6. What does coverage mean? That's different from saying, I want my students to understand the concept of derivative as a rate of change of a function, right? Focusing on what students learn. And that I have to think about my own practice in the context of what I want them to learn. So along with that, I need to know what is it that I want them to learn. I have to be transparent with myself, and then I have to be transparent with them. So if I know that I want them to understand the concept of a derivative as the rate of change of a function, then I can start to think about what learning activities and what assessments can I construct for my students to get them there or to move them in that direction. But all too often, the mathematics that students are exposed to are just the next chapter in the book or the activity that we have loved since time immemorial because it was so interesting, but it didn't necessarily help anyone learn. Life interferes with people's intentions, and I think all too often in the academy, we're just not flexible with our students. Now, this is a lot harder to do when you have a 600-person lecture than when you have 20 people in front of you. But as a general principle, to communicate to your students, I expect you to adhere to deadlines or to whatever other standards I've set before you. But I also understand that sometimes life takes you someplace else, and I need you to communicate with me so that we can figure out a way that you can keep developing as a student in a way that works for you. So that I know things are continuing. And that flexibility, it's amazing how just saying that to a student reduces so much stress, right? Let's see how we can work this out. It's just a huge offering to a student. And finally, using the model of, rather than pulling weeds, which is so much the model, that we're sowing seeds of mathematical excellence. We're sowing seeds of mathematical thinking and mathematical thought. And the fact that my students are in front of me means I believe in your ability to learn things. And what you learn might be different things, and to allow that to be okay, because they're all growing mathematically in different ways. This has become particularly important with my incarcerated students because they come into the classroom with such a broad range of mathematical understanding, skills at being a student, communication skills, learning skills. They're just from very, very different backgrounds, and they're thrown into this classroom. And to really be able to say, I believe in you, and you may grow in a different way than that person, and that's okay. That's really what we're after here. So I think that's all I had, but now I want to go back and tell you the anecdote about how what I learned about place value. I was an interviewer for the New York State process of elementary teachers applying for the designation of master teachers. So my part in the interview process was that these candidates had to deliver a lesson to the panel of us. And one third grade teacher was doing a lesson on place value. I'm just going to try to speak loud because I have to move my body to do this. Can you hear me now? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So she describes that she has people stand up with, everybody's holding a digit, except one person is holding the decimal point. And so there's some number that's displayed, 123.456, whatever it is. And after a few other activities, she said, I want everyone to multiply themselves by 10. So every student takes a step in this direction, except the decimal point, right? Because they multiplied by 10. And to me, the aha was, oh, you don't move the decimal point. Decimal point is right where it's always been, right between the ones and the tenths. It never goes anywhere. It's the numbers that move. And this was an important insight because I started thinking about all those rules we teach students, and they say, why? Why can I move the decimal point in some cases? Why, when I'm multiplying, do I ignore the decimal point and then count how many places and put it in? That's a random rule. But this helped me think about it in such a different way that it really informed my teaching very powerfully. And, you know, this is something that I learned at a very senior level in my career as a mathematician. So. And that's all I have.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions.
So what's the Bard Prison initiative?
The Bard Prison Initiative is an initiative at Bard College, privately funded, in which they offer college-level courses to students in 7 prisons in New York State. Many of the students are getting an associate's degree, and they're rolling out bachelor's degrees at more and more of those institutions as the students progress through the associates. They hire faculty mostly as adjuncts, and we go into the prison there. New York State requires students who don't have a high school diploma to get a GED, and for many students that means starting at an elementary education level. So there's a school building within the prison walls, and Bard has several of those classrooms as Bard classrooms. And we are told to be teaching the same level of rigor, the same level of demand as a course that you would be teaching on the Bard campus. And this is very challenging when you step over, sorry to be explicit, you step over some blood on your way into the class, or when someone limps in because they've been in a violent situation, or when there's the prison shuts down. New York State, a little less than a year ago, there was a strike of the corrections officers, so we couldn't get in for 5 weeks. And when we went back in, at the end of those 5 weeks, we didn't know what we were going to find because the news reports at the prisons overall in New York State talked about some horrible conditions, from people not getting fed or receiving their medications because there just wasn't staff to do it, to various degrees of violence and other kind of nasty things. So we didn't know what we would find in our students, and we went in with some trepidation. And I walked into class the first day I was teaching Calc 1, and one of my students rushed in with a piece of paper saying, I finally get related rates. Can you give me some more examples to practice? Because these students, if you think about it, this is New York's supermax prison. So many of these people have been incarcerated or will be incarcerated for a very long time, and they're living in some very dire circumstances. The ones who choose to go through what it takes to apply to college and to engage in college classes and do the work that's needed to do are, for the most part, really highly motivated and engaged. They are my favorite students I've ever had from that point of view. They want to understand. They want to advance mathematically. It's very exciting to see.
What are some resources for particular lesson plans that one produce?
Yeah, so I can't bring in anything that's not approved in advance, and the approval process takes weeks. So I can't just say, oh, I think tomorrow I'm going to bring in these manipulatives. That doesn't happen. So we end up having to get very creative. I did Mobius strips some time ago where the students were tearing strips of paper along the edge of a table, and we used Scotch tape because there's no scissors. So you have to innovate. They don't have internet access. I can get materials approved in advance, like if I have journal articles or other things, I have to plan way in advance. And then at times when I think, oh, I have this great idea of something new I want to bring in, I just try, and it depends which corrections officer is at the front, whether it comes in or not. And other than that, I write on a chalkboard with chalk, and I bring in the handouts that I can bring in. And
So my question was more selfish. That being, how do you find resources online that other people can use to increase compassion?
oh, for compassion. I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. I think the approach to teaching, where for me, teaching and compassion are so closely intertwined, applies with the incarcerated students as much as it does with any students I work with. But it takes different forms in different places.
I agree. We're on the same page.
And so being able to just say to the students, I believe in you. I know you can do this. And they'll say, no, I can't think mathematically. And I say, all right, let's talk about the mathematical things you do. And in the incarcerated population, invariably in every class, when we have that conversation, what are some mathematical things you can do? There's a couple of people over there talking about, one will say to the other, yes, you know how to do ratio. How many grams are in an ounce? Okay, how many grams are in a quarter ounce? See, that's a ratio. And they have those conversations, and they have knowledge to draw on. And just really showing that respect. One of the questions that I had when I listened to Ben and then I listened to Ted was, Ben was talking about what sounded to me like, don't trust things just because you're told them. You need to own the knowing. And Ted was talking about trust. And I was sort of struggling with putting that together. And I think it's about trusting yourself to draw conclusions, trusting the process that your teacher is engaging you in, trusting yourself as a thinker, and really encouraging that in the students, that I trust you, I know what you're capable of.
Yeah, but I'm not a compassionate person, okay? So I understand what you're saying. I mean, but it helps if you are compassionate yourself, I think. All right? You need some models to look at. I need a model to look at. It's okay. I'm just being,
Yeah. And we'll have a longer conversation after Francis's talk, so we can certainly continue. Maybe, is there time for more?
Yeah, we have time.
Okay. So,
You're talking to me think about learning differences and learning disabilities that I think are largely still ignored, but certainly were in the past and that we're not taught about as teachers. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that in this context, if you have any, of compassionate math teaching.
So let me start by saying I generally teach small classes, which is a whole different ballgame, because it allows me a lot more flexibility. At the liberal arts college I described, there are a lot of students with various sorts of accommodations, and they all send me their paperwork for the accommodations. And I don't know how to say this in a way that doesn't sound awful, but I ignore them, because I tell all my students, everybody, if something's not working for you, you need to let me know. So that whether you have documentation or not is not really what's driving me. If you need extra time on an exam just because you're very stressed because something horrible happened or you're sick or whatever, let's talk about it, see how we could do that. So I agree that we really need to change the narrative about people with special learning needs and not other than. Just the words we use for it, right? They have special learning needs. I don't know a way to say that. They just learn differently, but I learn differently than you do. And we all learn differently. So if we were able to change the narrative and really adopt that position of teaching is not a thing. It's not what I do. I facilitate learning. And that's where I think I can address whether it's accommodations for particular learning styles or weaker backgrounds or personal obstacles or whatever it is.
We might have time for one more question if anyone has.
Everybody doesn't want to be the last one to ask, so.
There's someone over there.
Oh, there we go. David, yeah.
I really liked the suffering, as you put it, and how you drew that out and how you related that to compassion. And I think it's something which I haven't framed in that way before, so I really appreciate that. And I guess the thing which I would like to reconcile is your first statement about passion and about sharing passion. And how do you then relate that sharing of passion, your other interpretation of compassion, with the suffering piece?
Years ago, I was teaching secondary students. I was in a high school, and I had one class that I referred to affectionately as my football team class, because they were, and it was Algebra 2, and this was their second or third time through Algebra 2, because they played football. That was where their minds were. And there was one day when I was up at the board with my back to the class, writing something, and I overheard one of them say to the one next to them, in like a stage whisper, "She really likes this stuff." Like amazed that was possible. And I turned around and I said, "Do you think I do this because it's the only job I can get?" And they said, "Well, yeah." So I pulled out of my purse a book I was reading at the time that happened to be something mathematical that was just my pleasure reading. And I talked with them about that. And these were people who felt they were suffering through math. I'm not afraid to show them my joy. And then when they discover something, to celebrate it. They don't even realize that that's something they can be joyful about. To say, "Look what you just did." I had a 5th grader once who discovered some pattern in Pascal's triangle that I had never seen before, and that I didn't even understand what she was trying to tell me. But I kept saying, "I'm not getting it, tell me, tell me." And I finally saw it. And the joy in her that she discovered this thing, and that I recognized that the fact that I didn't understand did not mean she was wrong, right?
Exactly.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.